Ma'am, you're trespassing. The manager wants you out. Stand up, now.
I paid for my drink. I'm sitting quietly. You have no legal basis to touch me.
This isn't a debate. Private property. Last warning.
You should slow down, officer. You're about to arrest the owner of this building.
Yeah? Save it for the judge. Turn around.
Officer Craig Bartlett had been with the Seattle Police Department for 8 years when he walked into a situation that would destroy his career. Officer Derek Thorne had been with the precinct for only 6 years, but his reputation for aggression was already well established when he made the decision that would cost the city $4.5 million. He was 32 years old, arrogant, and possessed a dangerous belief that his badge granted him immunity from consequence. On a bright Wednesday morning in an upscale district, he received a dispatch call regarding a hostile trespasser refusing to vacate a business. The trespasser was Eleanor Vance, a 54-year-old real estate mogul and philanthropist who happened to be wearing a gray jogging suit. What Thorne failed to realize as he strutted into the cafe with his hand resting on his holster was that Eleanor Vance wasn't just a patron. She was the owner of the building, the owner of the cafe, and quite possibly the reason the precinct had its new gymnasium equipment. What followed, ignoring her calm explanations, mocking her claims of ownership, and dragging her out in handcuffs before a stunned crowd, would become a definitive case study in how implicit bias can dismantle a life's work in minutes. Before we get into the details of this catastrophic failure of judgment, tell us where you are watching from. If you believe accountability is essential in law enforcement, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these illuminate the cracks in our system, and your support helps us keep the spotlight on the truth. The Velvet Bean was the jewel of the Downtown Revitalization Project. Located on the corner of Main and 5th, it was an architectural marvel of glass and reclaimed wood, catering to the city's elite stockbrokers, attorneys, and tech executives. It was 9:15 a.m. on a Wednesday. The sun was cutting through the high windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The aroma of roasted Ethiopian beans and fresh pastries filled the room. Every leather armchair and oak table was occupied by men in suits and women in tailored dresses. Eleanor Vance had entered the shop at 8:45 a.m. She had just finished her morning power walk along the river, a ritual she had maintained for 2 decades. She was dressed in a comfortable, albeit expensive gray velour tracksuit and running shoes. Her hair was pulled back in a practical bun. She carried no purse, only her phone and a small key card tucked into her pocket. Eleanor Vance was a titan of industry. She had built her empire from the ground up, starting with a single laundromat in her 20s and expanding into a portfolio of commercial real estate worth hundreds of millions. She was known in the boardroom for her steel-trap mind and in the community for her generous heart. But today she was just a woman checking on her investment. She had purchased the Velvet Bean 6 months prior, keeping her ownership quiet to observe how the business ran without her direct interference. She ordered a green tea, found a secluded table in the corner, and began observing the staff taking mental notes on workflow and customer service. She was quiet. She was peaceful. She was bothering absolutely no one. But to the eyes of the man behind the counter, her presence was a stain on the establishment's aesthetic. Ryan Miller was 26 years old and had been the manager of the Velvet Bean for exactly 3 months. He was hired for his background in high-end hospitality, a resume that he polished more frequently than the silverware. Ryan was ambitious, insecure, and deeply obsessed with curating the atmosphere. He believed that, for a coffee shop to justify charging $7 for a latte, the clientele had to look the part. He wanted the shop to look like a brochure for luxury living. When he looked across the room and saw Eleanor Vance, a black woman in a sweatsuit sitting among the suits and ties, his bias kicked into overdrive. In Ryan's limited worldview, women like Eleanor didn't drink tea in places like this. They were usually there to clean the floors or ask for change. He watched her for 20 minutes. She wasn't on a laptop. She wasn't reading a newspaper. She was just sitting looking around, occasionally typing into her phone. To Ryan, this was casing the joint, or simply loitering. He decided that she was lowering the property value just by sitting there. He smoothed his tie, took a deep breath, and convinced himself he was protecting the brand. He walked out from behind the counter, putting on his most condescending smile. "Excuse me," Ryan said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "This table is for paying customers only. We have a policy against loitering." Eleanor looked up surprised, but calm. "I have a drink," she said, gesturing to the tea. "And I'm not loitering. I'm observing." Ryan sneered. "You've been nursing that tea for 30 minutes. We have paying customers waiting for tables. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Eleanor held his gaze, her expression unreadable. "I'm comfortable right where I am, young man. Is there a problem with my presence?" Ryan's face reddened. "The problem is that you don't fit the environment we're trying to maintain. You need to leave, now." Eleanor Vance had faced down zoning boards, hostile competitors, and market crashes. A 26-year-old manager with a superiority complex was not going to intimidate her. "I am not leaving," she said, her voice even. "I suggest you return to the counter and focus on the line of customers you are currently ignoring." Ryan felt his authority crumbling. He couldn't physically remove her, and she clearly wasn't going to obey him. His ego was bruised, and in his mind there was only one escalation path left. He retreated to the back office and dialed the non-emergency police line, though his tone suggested an emergency. "This is the manager at the Velvet Bean on Main. I have a trespasser who is refusing to leave. She's becoming hostile." The dispatcher asked the standard questions. "Is she armed? Is she violent?" Ryan hesitated, then lied. "She's aggressive. She's shouting at staff and disturbing the customers. I think she might be on something. I need an officer here immediately." The die was cast. The call went out. Officer Derek Thorne was 2 blocks away finishing a traffic stop. When the call came over the radio, "Disturbance at the Velvet Bean, hostile subject refusing to vacate." Thorne's eyes lit up. He hated hostile subjects. He loved the adrenaline of non-compliance. Officer Thorne had a file at Internal Affairs that was 3 inches thick. 7 complaints in 6 years, 4 for excessive force, 3 for verbal abuse. He was known as a heavy-handed officer, the kind who saw every interaction as a battle for dominance. His supervisors had warned him about his temper, about his tendency to escalate situations that required de-escalation, but the police union had always managed to save his job. He believed he was the thin blue line between order and chaos. He didn't see citizens. He saw potential perps. Thorne pulled his cruiser up to the curb tires, screeching slightly for effect. He adjusted his belt, checked his body camera, which he often forgot to turn on, though today it was active, and marched toward the entrance. He had already decided what was happening inside. A vagrant, probably mentally ill, was harassing good, tax-paying citizens. It was his job to take out the trash. He burst through the door, his presence sucking the oxygen out of the room. Ryan Miller rushed to meet him, playing the victim perfectly. "Officer, thank God. She's over there. She won't listen to anyone. She's scaring the customers." Ryan pointed a shaking finger at Eleanor, who was calmly sipping her tea. Thorne looked at the woman. He saw the gray sweatsuit. He saw the sneakers. He saw the skin color. And just like that, the narrative was locked. He didn't see a matriarch. He saw a nuisance. He bypassed the witnesses, bypassed the investigation, and walked straight to her table. Eleanor saw him coming. She set her cup down. "Ma'am," Thorne barked, his hand resting near his taser. "The manager wants you gone. You're trespassing. Up! Now!" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes analyzing him with the scrutiny of a woman who insured entire city blocks. "Officer, I am sitting quietly. I have paid for my drink. I have done nothing to warrant this intrusion." Thorne leaned in, invading her personal space. "This is private property. If the manager says you go, you go. I'm not going to ask you twice. Grab your trash and get out." "You are making a mistake," Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming colder. "A very expensive mistake. I suggest you lower your voice and ask yourself why you are assuming I have no right to be here." Thorne laughed, a harsh barking sound. "I don't need to ask myself anything. I'm looking at a woman who thinks she can camp out in a high-end business and refuse lawful orders. Let me see some ID." Eleanor didn't move. "I don't have my ID on me. I am out for a walk." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "No ID. Refusing to leave okay. We're doing this the hard way." The cafe had gone silent. The clinking of spoons and the hiss of the espresso machine stopped. Everyone was watching. A young woman at the next table pulled out her phone. A businessman across the aisle did the same. "Officer," Eleanor said clearly and loudly for the cameras, "I am telling you that I have every right to be here. In fact, I have more right to be here than you do." Thorne's patience, which was non-existent to begin with, snapped. "That's it. Stand up. You're under arrest for trespassing and failure to comply." He reached out and grabbed Eleanor's arm. She didn't flinch, but she pulled her arm back firmly. "Do not touch me." Thorne took this as resistance. He grabbed her shoulder, spinning her in her chair. "Stop resisting. Stand up." Eleanor stood not out of fear, but to maintain her dignity. "I am the owner of this building," she stated, her voice cutting through the tension. "I own the Velvet Bean. I own the land it sits on. You are arresting the proprietor." Ryan Miller, standing behind the officer, let out a nervous, incredulous laugh. "She's lying. Look at her. She's crazy. She doesn't own anything." Thorne smirked. "Yeah, and I'm the King of England. Tell it to the judge, lady." He spun Eleanor around, forcing her chest against the table. He pulled her arms behind her back with unnecessary force. The metal cuffs clicked shut, biting into her wrists. "You're hurting me," Eleanor said, wincing. "These are too tight." "They're not made for comfort," Thorne spat back. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you decided to play make-believe." The crowd was murmuring now. "Hey, she said she owns the place," a man in a blue suit called out. "Did you check?" "Stay back," Thorne yelled at the crowd. "Unless you want to join her for obstruction." He hauled Eleanor away from the table. She stumbled, but caught her footing. She held her head high despite the humiliation of being manhandled in her own establishment. "Officer," she said, looking him in the eye. "What is your badge number?" "It's right here." Thorne tapped his chest. "Thorne, remember it." "Oh, I will," Eleanor replied. "I will make sure everyone remembers it." He shoved her toward the door. Ryan Miller watched with a smug grin, crossing his arms, believing he had just won a great victory for the ambiance of his cafe. He had no idea he had just signed his own professional death warrant. The walk to the patrol car was a parade of shame. Thorne gripped Eleanor's upper arm tightly, marching her past the large glass windows where she had stood with the architects just a year prior approving the blueprints. Pedestrians stopped to watch. More phones were raised. "Stop resisting," Thorne said loudly for the benefit of the cameras, even though Eleanor was walking perfectly in step with him. "I am not resisting," she said calmly. "I am documenting." He opened the back door of the cruiser and pushed her inside. The hard plastic seat was unforgiving. It smelled of stale sweat and disinfectant. As Thorne slammed the door, Eleanor took a deep breath. She closed her eyes for a moment, controlling the rage that threatened to boil over. She was a woman of immense power, yet in this moment she was reduced to a stereotype by a man with a high school diploma and a badge. But Eleanor Vance didn't just get mad. She got even. She began to formulate the strategy. She mentally listed the people she would call the moment she was given access to a phone: her chief legal counsel, the mayor who she had hosted for a fundraiser 2 weeks ago, and the police commissioner who sat on the board of her charity. As Thorne climbed into the driver's seat, humming to himself, satisfied with a good catch, he had no clue that he was transporting a woman who could buy and sell his entire precinct. "You really think that story is going to fly?" Thorne asked, watching her in the rear-view mirror as he merged into traffic. "Claiming you own the place, that's a new one. Usually it's, I'm waiting for a friend." Eleanor remained silent. She knew the power of silence. It unnerved people. Thorne continued to taunt her. "We'll get your prints. Find out who you really are. Probably have a few warrants, huh? That's why you didn't have ID." Eleanor looked out the window at the city she helped build. "Officer Thorne," she finally said, "I want you to enjoy this drive. It will be the last time you ever drive a police vehicle." Thorne laughed again. "Threatening an officer. I'll add that to the charge sheet." The drive to the precinct took 15 minutes. They arrived at the downtown station, a brutalist concrete building that Eleanor's construction firm had actually renovated 5 years earlier. Thorne pulled into the Sally Port, hauled her out, and marched her to the booking desk. The station was busy. Officers were processing arrests, typing reports, drinking bad coffee. Thorne walked Eleanor up to the desk. Sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Lieutenant Henderson, who was 3 years away from retirement. "What do we have, Thorne?" Henderson asked, not looking up from his paperwork. "Trespassing at the Velvet Bean, refused to leave, refused to. Claimed she owned the place. No ID, resisted arrest." Thorne sounded proud. Henderson looked up. He adjusted his glasses. He looked at the woman in the gray sweatsuit. Then he looked closer. His face went pale. The color drained from his cheeks so fast it looked like he might faint. He stood up slowly. "Thorne," Henderson said, his voice trembling slightly, "take the cuffs off." Thorne looked confused. "What, Sarge? She's uncooperative. She refused to ID." "Take the goddamn cuffs off right now!" Henderson roared, his voice echoing through the booking area. The entire room went silent. Thorne, stunned, fumbled for his keys. "Sarge, I don't understand." Henderson walked around the desk. He looked at Eleanor with horror and apology in his eyes. "Ms. Vance, Eleanor, I am so incredibly sorry." Eleanor rubbed her wrists where the red welts were forming. She looked at Henderson. "Hello, George. How is your wife? Did the surgery go well?" Thorne's jaw dropped. You know her." Henderson turned to Thorne, his eyes burning with a mixture of fury and pity. "You idiot! You absolute moron! This is Eleanor Vance. She owns the Vance Tower. She owns the Riverside Complex. And yes, you imbecile, she owns the Velvet Bean." Thorne felt the world tilt on its axis. The blood rushed in his ears. "But she was wearing... She didn't look like..." "Like what?" Eleanor interjected, her voice sharp as a razor. "Like an owner. Like a person deserving of respect." "Or did I look like someone you could bully?" Thorne stammered. The manager called. He said, 'The manager is a fool,'" Eleanor said. "And you are a danger to this city." She turned to Henderson. "I want to file a formal complaint. I want his badge number, his supervisor's name, and I want a phone to call my attorney. And George, I want the chief down here. Now." The next hour was a blur of panic for the Seattle Police Department. The police chief arrived in 20 minutes, breathless and apologizing profusely. Eleanor sat in the chief's office holding an ice pack to her wrist, while Thorne sat in an interrogation room stripped of his weapon and badge, realizing his life was over. The video from the coffee shop had already hit the internet. The hashtag Velvet Bean Arrest was trending one locally. It showed everything: the calm refusal, the sudden violence, the claim of ownership, the laughter of the officer. The optics were impossible to defend. The fallout was swift, brutal, and absolute. The lawsuit was filed the next morning. It named Officer Derek Thorne, the Seattle Police Department, Ryan Miller, and the security firm that contracted him. The charges were unlawful arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, and defamation. The city attorneys took one look at the evidence, the video, the witness statements, and the identity of the victim, and told the mayor to settle immediately. There would be no trial. It would be a slaughter. The city agreed to a settlement of $4.5 million to Eleanor Vance. Eleanor, in a move that made headlines, announced that every cent of the settlement would be donated to a legal defense fund for those who couldn't afford to fight wrongful arrests. But the money was just the beginning. Ryan Miller was fired before the sun set on the day of the arrest. He tried to claim he was just following policy, but the corporate office of the hospitality group, which Eleanor also had shares in, issued a statement condemning his appalling lack of judgment and racial bias. He was blacklisted from the industry. His career in luxury hospitality was dead at 26. Officer Derek Thorne fared no better. The internal affairs investigation, fueled by the pressure of a high-profile victim, dug up everything. The prior complaints that had been swept under the rug were re-examined. The pattern of aggression against minority citizens was laid bare. Thorne was terminated for cause 3 weeks later. He was decertified by the state board, meaning he could never work as a police officer again in the state. At 32, with a mortgage and a baby on the way, Thorne found himself unemployed and unemployable in the only field he knew. He had defined himself by the power he held over others, and now he was powerless. Eleanor Vance returned to the Velvet Bean a month later. She wore the same gray sweatsuit. This time, the new manager, a woman named Sarah, who had been promoted from a different branch, greeted her by name and had her green tea waiting. The customers, some of whom had witnessed the arrest, nodded in respect. Eleanor sat at the same table. She didn't come back to gloat. She came back to reclaim her space, to prove that she belonged not because she owned the deed, but because she was a human being. This incident wasn't just about bad manners or a misunderstanding. It was about the dangerous assumptions we make when we look at one another. Ryan Miller saw a sweatshirt and saw a threat. Officer Thorne saw skin color and saw a criminal. Both men allowed their biases to override logic, procedure, and basic human decency. They assumed that authority gave them the right to define who belongs and who doesn't. They were wrong. Eleanor Vance had the resources to fight back. She had the connections to get the chief out of bed. She had the money to hire the best lawyers. But as she sat there, sipping her tea, looking out the window, she thought about the thousands of others who didn't. What happens to the person in the sweatsuit who doesn't own the building? What happens to the young man who can't call the mayor? That is the real tragedy. Thorne and Miller were punished because they picked the wrong victim, not because the system suddenly grew a conscience. Justice for Eleanor was swift, but justice for the invisible remains elusive. What do you think needs to change to prevent this from happening to people without Eleanor's power? Should police be required to verify property ownership claims before making arrests for trespassing in commercial spaces? And do you think the $4.5 million settlement was enough, or should the officers face criminal charges for unlawful imprisonment? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. These conversations are difficult, but they are necessary. If you found this story compelling, please like and share it. We need to keep holding up the mirror, even when the reflection is ugly. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and know your rights.
Sir, I told you already, this floor is restricted. Take your coffee and leave, now.
I'm not loitering. I paid, I have a meeting upstairs, and you're blocking me without cause.
I don't care who you say you are. You're trespassing. Hands where I can see them.
You're refusing to verify my ID. This is harassment, and it's on camera.
The high-definition security lens mounted in the corner of the polished marble ceiling recorded at 60 frames per second, capturing every nuance of the sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Arlington Plaza lobby. It was 10:15 on a Tuesday morning, the kind of crisp, bright day that usually signals productivity and routine. But the digital eye wasn't just recording the play of light. It was about to document a collision between ignorance and authority that would ultimately bankrupt a security firm and ruin a young man's life. The man stepping up to the coffee counter, the one about to be humiliated, had no idea that his morning latte was going to turn into a federal case. Marcus Thorne adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke charcoal suit, checked his watch, and waited his turn. To the casual observer, Marcus was just a well-dressed older black man with graying temples and a calm demeanor. But Marcus Thorne was not just a customer. He was a senior ethics officer for the United States Department of Justice, a man who had spent the last 30 years of his life dissecting institutional failure, prosecuting corruption, and ensuring that the machinery of the federal government operated within the bounds of the Constitution. He had the power to initiate investigations that could topple agency directors. He held top-secret clearance, and right now he was about to be treated like a trespasser by a 28-year-old security guard named Kyle Vance, whose primary qualification for the job was a clean driving record and a willingness to wear a polyester uniform. Kyle was standing near the elevators, his arms crossed, watching Marcus with a look that wasn't just suspicious, it was predatory. Kyle had been on this post for 3 months. He was bored, he was eager to prove his worth to his supervisors, and he carried a set of biases that he wasn't even aware he possessed. When he saw Marcus standing in line looking at his phone, Kyle didn't see a federal official reviewing case notes. He saw someone who didn't fit. He saw a threat to the pristine, exclusive atmosphere of the Arlington Plaza. Before we get into the details of this infuriating encounter, I need you to take a second. Look at the subscribe button. If you believe that a badge, whether it's plastic or metal, should never be a license to discriminate, go ahead and click it. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. This story is going to make your blood boil, and you need to be part of this conversation. Kyle pushed off the wall and began to walk toward the coffee kiosk. His stride was heavy, purposeful. He adjusted his belt, which was weighed down by a radio, a flashlight, and a set of key symbols of authority that he was about to misuse in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. Marcus, meanwhile, reached the counter. "Good morning," he said to the barista, a young woman who smiled back. "Large black coffee, please, and a bottle of water." It was the order of a man with work to do. He pulled out his wallet, a sleek leather bifold, and tapped his card on the reader. The transaction was approved. He was a paying customer in a building that was open to the public on the ground floor. But as he turned to wait for his drink, his path was blocked. Kyle Vance stood less than 2 feet away, invading Marcus's personal space with aggressive intent. "Excuse me," Marcus said, assuming the guard was simply in the way. He took a half step to the right. Kyle mirrored the movement, stepping to his left to block Marcus again. The lobby was quiet enough that the scuff of the guard's boots on the marble echoed. "We have a no loitering policy," Kyle said. His voice was loud-pitched to carry designed to embarrass. He wasn't asking a question. He was issuing a command. Marcus looked at the young man, really looked at him. Analyzing the situation with the same cold precision he used when reviewing ethics violations. He saw the name tag K. Vance. He saw the nervous energy, the dilated pupils, the aggressive stance. "I'm not loitering, Mr. Vance," Marcus replied, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that had commanded silence in federal courtrooms. "I just purchased a coffee. I have a meeting on the 42nd floor in 20 minutes. This was the truth. Marcus was meeting with a team of corporate monitors regarding a compliance settlement. But the truth didn't matter to Kyle. The truth was inconvenient because it contradicted the narrative he had already written in his head. "The 42nd floor is restricted access." Kyle snapped his hand, drifting toward his radio. "We don't have any deliveries scheduled for up there, and we don't allow solicitors in the building. You need to take your coffee and leave, now." It was an insult wrapped in an order. Deliveries. Solicitors. Kyle had looked at a man in a $3,000 suit and decided he must be a delivery driver or a beggar. Marcus felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. The old, weary anger of a man who has fought this battle 1,000 times. But he pushed it down. He remained professional. "I am not a solicitor," Marcus said, his tone sharpening just enough to cut through the ambient noise of the lobby. "I am a federal officer. I have business in this building. If you step aside, I will be on my way, and we can both pretend this lapse in judgment never happened." Kyle's face flushed a blotchy red. He hadn't expected pushback. He expected compliance. He expected fear. The fact that this man was standing his ground, looking him in the eye, and using words like lapse in judgment felt like a challenge to his authority. "I don't care who you say you are." Kyle spat out, his voice rising. "I'm the head of security for this shift, and I'm telling you that you are trespassing. You're causing a disturbance." The irony was palpable. The only person causing a disturbance was Kyle. People were stopping to watch. A businessman in a tan coat paused near the revolving doors. A woman with a briefcase slowed down, her eyes darting between the two men. Marcus knew exactly what was happening. He was being baited. If he raised his voice, if he pointed a finger, if he showed even a sliver of aggression, Kyle would have the justification he needed to escalate. "I am going to reach into my pocket," Marcus said slowly, telegraphing his movements. "I am going to show you my credentials." "Don't reach for anything," Kyle yelled, taking a step back and putting a hand on his pepper spray canister. "Back away. Keep your hands where I can see them." It was a performance. Kyle was playing the role of the brave defender protecting the building from a non-existent threat. "You are refusing to look at my identification," Marcus stated clearly, speaking not just to Kyle but to the security cameras he knew were recording above. "I'm trying to verify my status as a tenant guest, and you are obstructing me. This is harassment." "That's it," Kyle said, grabbing his radio. "I'm calling it in. You had your chance." He keyed the mic, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Dispatch, I've got a code 3 in the main lobby. Hostile male subject refusing to leave, acting aggressively toward staff. I need PD here now." The lie hung in the air, toxic and dangerous. Hostile, aggressive. These were trigger words, words that turned a misunderstanding into a life-or-death situation. Marcus stood perfectly still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, the picture of non-aggression. But he knew that whoever was listening to that radio dispatch, and whoever the police dispatcher called, would arrive with a mental image of a violent man. Kyle Vance wasn't just kicking him out, he was weaponizing the police force against him. "You realize," Marcus said softly, "that filing a false report is a crime. You are on camera, Mr. Vance. Everything you just said is demonstrably false." Kyle smirked. It was the smirk of someone who believes the system was built to protect him, not the man standing in front of him. "It's my word against yours," Kyle said, lowering the radio but keeping his hand near his belt. "And I'm the one wearing the badge." Marcus didn't respond to the taunt. He simply shifted his weight, planted his feet, and waited. He could have walked away. He could have left the coffee, walked out the door, and called his contact on the 42nd floor to come down and get him. But Marcus Thorne had spent a lifetime holding people accountable. If he walked away now, this guard would do the same thing to the next person, someone younger, someone with fewer resources, someone who might not survive the encounter. So Marcus stayed. He waited for the sirens. The wait lasted 7 minutes. In that time, the crowd in the lobby grew. A few people had their phones out now, the unblinking eyes of the public recording the standoff. Kyle paced back and forth, puffing out his chest, occasionally talking into his radio to give updates on the suspect's behavior, even though the suspect hadn't moved an inch. Marcus focused on his breathing. He reviewed the legal statutes in his mind. 42 U.S. Code Section 1983. Civil action for deprivation of rights. He mentally drafted the complaint. He was at work even now. When the patrol car pulled up to the curb, lights flashing but no siren, Marcus saw 2 officers exit. They were young, perhaps in their early 30s, looking tense. The dispatch call had primed them for a fight. They entered the lobby quickly, their hands hovering near their holsters. Kyle Vance rushed to meet them, intercepting the officers before they could assess the scene themselves. "He's right there," Kyle said, pointing an accusing finger at Marcus. "He refused to leave. He started shouting at staff, and when I asked for ID, he made a move for his pocket like he had a weapon. I'm telling you, he's unhinged." The officers, Miller and Davies, turned their attention to Marcus. They didn't see a senior government official. They saw what Kyle told them to see a problem. Officer Miller, the larger of the two, stepped forward, his face hard. "Sir, turn around and place your hands behind your back." Marcus didn't blink. "Officer, I am the victim of harassment here. I have identification in my pocket that will clarify. I didn't ask you for a speech." Miller barked, closing the distance. "I said, turn around. You are being detained for trespassing and disorderly conduct." "I am not trespassing," Marcus said, his voice calm but firm. "I am a federal employee with a scheduled meeting. If you would simply allow me to show you my credentials." "Sir, stop resisting," Officer Davies shouted, flanking him. It was the classic escalation tactic. Define any verbal explanation as resistance. Define any non-compliance with an unlawful order as a threat. Miller grabbed Marcus's left arm, twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. A sharp pain shot up Marcus's shoulder, a reminder of an old rotator cuff injury, but he didn't flinch. He allowed them to manipulate his body. He felt the cold, heavy steel of the handcuffs click onto his left wrist, then his right. There is a specific sound that handcuffs make, a ratcheting click that signals the total loss of freedom. For Marcus, a man who had dedicated his life to the concept of justice, hearing that sound applied to his own wrists was a profound violation. The lobby had gone silent. The cameras were rolling. The witnesses were watching. And there stood Marcus Thorne, a man with the authority to audit the FBI, handcuffed like a common criminal in the lobby of a building where he was arguably the most powerful person in the room. Kyle Vance stood a few feet away, a look of smug satisfaction plastered across his face. He had won. He had summoned the power of the state to crush this man who dared to talk back to him. Officer Miller patted Marcus down, his hands rough as they searched for weapons. "He said he had a weapon," Miller asked Kyle. "He reached for something," Kyle said, slightly modifying his story now that the police were actually there. "I wasn't taking any chances." Miller reached into Marcus's inside jacket pocket. He felt the wallet. He pulled it out. "Let's see who we have here," Miller muttered. He flipped the wallet open. The first thing he saw was the driver's license. Marcus Thorne, address in an upscale neighborhood. But then Miller's thumb brushed against the second flap of the wallet. It fell open. Inside was not a credit card or a library card. Mounted in the leather was a gold shield. Not a security badge. A heavy federal shield. Next to it was a laminated ID card with the seal of the Department of Justice and the words, "Senior Ethics Officer," printed in bold, undeniable letters. Officer Miller froze. He stared at the badge. He looked at the ID. He looked at the name. Then he looked up at the man he was currently holding in handcuffs. The color drained from Miller's face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug. At that exact moment, the elevator doors pinged open. A man in a police lieutenant's uniform walked out. This was Lieutenant Gary Hatcher, the watch commander for the district, who happened to be in the building for a coordination meeting with the building's management. He saw the commotion. He saw his officers. He saw the man in handcuffs. And then he saw the lapel pin on Marcus's jacket, a small, discreet eagle holding a scale. Hatcher stopped dead in his tracks. He knew that pin. He knew what it meant because he had been briefed on it during federal cooperation training. Hatcher walked over, his pace quickening to a near run. "Miller?" Hatcher barked. "What do you have there?" Miller couldn't speak. He just held up the wallet, his hand shaking slightly. Hatcher looked at the credentials. He looked at Marcus. He recognized him now. He had seen Marcus Thorne's picture in a bulletin regarding federal oversight of local task forces. "Uncuff him," Hatcher said. His voice was quiet, deadly quiet. "Sir?" Officer Davies asked, confused. "I said uncuff him right now." Hatcher roared, the sound echoing off the marble walls. "Do you have any idea who you are holding?" Kyle Vance, who had been smiling a moment ago, felt the atmosphere shift. He took a half step back. "He was trespassing, Lieutenant," Kyle said, trying to regain control of the narrative. "He was refuse." "Be quiet!" Hatcher snapped at the guard, not even looking at him. Miller fumbled with the keys. The metal clicked. The cuffs were removed. Marcus brought his hands around to the front. He didn't rub his wrists. He didn't grimace. He simply adjusted his jacket, straightened his tie, and reached out his hand. "My wallet, officer," Marcus said. Miller handed it back like it was made of radioactive material. Marcus placed it back in his pocket. He turned to Lieutenant Hatcher. "Lieutenant," Marcus said, his voice even and controlled, "I am Marcus Thorne, Department of Justice. I want your body camera footage tagged and preserved immediately. I want the lobby security footage pulled and secured before it can be deleted, and I want the contact information for this security guard's employer." Kyle Vance started to panic. "Wait a minute," he stammered. "You can't just... He was acting suspicious. I have a job to do." Marcus turned to look at Kyle for the first time since the handcuffs went on. The look was withering. "Your job," Marcus said, "was to verify my identity. Instead, you chose to profile me, detain me, and file a false police report claiming I was aggressive. That is a federal civil rights violation." Marcus turned back to the lieutenant. "Lieutenant, I am formally requesting that you take a statement from this man regarding his false report, and I want the names and badge numbers of these 2 officers who detained me without establishing reasonable, articulable suspicion." Officer Davies looked like he was about to be sick. "Sir, we were just responding to the call," he pleaded. "The guard said you were hostile." "And you believed him without investigation," Marcus countered. "You laid hands on me within 30 seconds of entering the building. You did not ask for my version of events. You did not ask for witnesses. You acted as the enforcement arm of this man's bias. That is actionable negligence." The lobby was dead silent. The shoppers were still recording. The video of the aggressive suspect dismantling the police with calm legal jargon was already being uploaded to social media. Kyle Vance looked at the lieutenant looking for support. "You guys know me," Kyle said. "I call you guys all the time." Hatcher looked at Kyle with pure disdain. "Yeah, Vance, we know you, and frankly your calls are usually garbage. But this one just cost the city a fortune." Marcus didn't leave. He didn't go to his meeting yet. He stood there and dictated the terms of the investigation into his own arrest. He made the officers write down his statement word for word. He made sure the building manager was called down. When the manager, a frantic man named Mr. Henderson, arrived, he was apologetic to the point of desperation. "Mr. Thorne, please. This is a terrible misunderstanding. We can fix this. Can we offer you..." "You can offer me the preservation of evidence," Marcus cut him off. "And you can prepare for a lawsuit. Because this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a policy failure." The lawsuit was filed 4 days later. Thorne versus Vance Sentinel Security and the City Police Department. It was a masterpiece of legal drafting. Marcus didn't hire an outside firm. He wrote the initial complaint himself, though he eventually retained a high-powered civil rights firm to litigate it, so he wouldn't have a conflict of interest with his DOJ duties. The complaint alleged Fourth Amendment violations, false imprisonment, defamation, and negligent hiring. The discovery phase was brutal. Marcus's lawyers demanded Kyle Vance's entire employment history. They found what everyone suspected, but no one had documented. Kyle had 6 prior complaints for harassment, all of them against Black or Hispanic men. All of them dismissed by Sentinel Security as unfounded. In the deposition, Marcus sat across from the CEO of Sentinel Security. The CEO was a man who was used to bullying claimants into small settlements. He wasn't ready for Marcus. "Mr. CEO," Marcus's lawyer asked, "did you review the footage of the incident?" "I did," the CEO grunted. And did you see Mr. Thorne acting aggressively? He refused to leave. That's not the question. Did you see aggression? The CEO paused. He was uncooperative. Is uncooperative a crime in your policy manual? Does it justify physical blocking and false police reports? The CEO stayed silent. They played the audio of Kyle's 911 call. They played it side by side with the silent video of Marcus standing perfectly still. The discrepancy was undeniable. It was perjury. The city attorney, realizing the exposure, settled with Marcus quickly regarding the police department's role. They agreed to new training protocols for responding to suspicious person calls requiring officers to independently verify behavior before detention. But Sentinel Security wanted to fight. They thought a jury might sympathize with a working man just doing his job. They were wrong. As the trial date approached, the video went viral. Millions of views. The comment sections were filled with people sharing their own stories of being stopped by rent-a-cops on power trips. The pressure mounted. 3 days before jury selection, Sentinel Security collapsed. They offered a settlement of $1.4 million. They also agreed to a consent decree, a legally binding agreement to overhaul their hiring and training practices specifically regarding racial bias and de-escalation. Kyle Vance was terminated immediately. His security license was permanently revoked by the state licensing board after the false report charge was substantiated. He was 28 years old and he had made himself unemployable in the only field he knew. Marcus accepted the settlement, but he didn't keep the money. He stood on the steps of the federal courthouse, the check in his hand, and announced the creation of the Thorne Legal Defense Fund. This money, Marcus told the reporters, his voice steady and grave, is for the people who don't have a badge in their pocket. It is for the teenager in the hoodie, the father in the work truck, the mother waiting for the bus. It is for everyone who is presumed guilty simply because they are present. He looked directly into the camera. I was able to stop this because I knew the law and I carried the shield of the federal government. But ask yourselves what would have happened if I had just been Marcus? That is the question that should haunt us. What if he had been a school teacher, a mechanic, a nurse? Without that DOJ ID, Marcus Thorne would have been booked, printed, and charged. The lie Kyle Vance told would have become the official record. The truth would have been buried under a pile of paperwork and qualified immunity. Justice was served in this case, yes, but it was served only because the victim happened to be more powerful than the oppressor. That isn't justice. That's a stroke of luck. Marcus Thorne went back to work the next day. He still gets his coffee from the lobby. The new guards know him by name. They smile. They are polite. But every time Marcus walks through those glass doors, he remembers the click of the handcuffs. He remembers the feeling of being reduced to a suspect in the blink of an eye. And he knows that the work isn't done. This story matters because it strips away the excuse of just following orders. It shows us that bias isn't just a thought. It's an action that destroys lives. If this story resonated with you, if it made you think about who we believe and why, please share it. Send it to a friend, a family member, or someone who needs to understand the reality of what people face every day. And don't forget to subscribe. We need to keep telling these stories until we don't have to anymore. What do you think was $1.4 million enough to teach them a lesson? Let me know in the comments below. Stay safe, stay aware, and know your rights.